You could hear the laughter before you saw their faces. It wasn't the kind of laughter that warmed room or stitched people together. No, this was the brittle, hollow kind. The sound of people keeping fear at bay with mockery. Joe stepped into the Hull clubhouse with the weight of 3 generations behind him and the quiet of someone woes. At the seen desert swallow cities, mud still clung to his boots, refusing to dry, and in his arms was a small carton of eggs, not supermarket kind, but speckled brown, uneven, still warm from the coop. Peace offering, maybe. A habit or a dare. He didn't say, didn't need to. He wasn't dressed like him. No collared shirt with tennis brand stitched over the heart. No watch shiny enough to distract from lack of substance. Just denim overalls faded into their own shade of loyalty, flannel lined with years, and straw hat that didn't bother coming off unless the wind asked nicely. The moment he took seat near the snack table, the air shifted. Not because of his presence. Joe didn't up space like that, but because the masks of courtesy began to crack. Crinette, the HOA president, with her pearls drawn so tight around her neck they seemed to whisper threats, leaned over with a stiff smirk and said just loud enough of that. Man brings chickens to community and thinks eggs make up for it. A few low chuckles followed, the kind people do when they're desperate to belong to something, even if it's cruelty. Another voice hissed, heard as go date someone's mailbox. They laughed again, harder now, emboldened by each other bows. Descardis. Joe didn't look up. Just reached into the pocket of his overalls, pulled out a handkerchief, and wiped a smudge of yolk off one of the eggs, like he hadn't heard, like the room didn't exist. But he had heard. He always did. He just understood something they did. Power doesn't come from the throat, it comes from stillness. By the time Crinette tapped her little wooden gavel and called the meeting to order, the room was bloated with condescension. She didn't waste time. Tonight's topic, she announced, this neighborhood beautification. That word, beautification. Rolling off her tongue-like blade dipped in syrup. What followed was a parade of absurdity. A fine for grass too high by 1/8 of an inch, an offense for painting, a garage door an unapproved shade of ivory, and then delivered with zero eye contact and maximum disdain, a violation for rural intrusion. That last one was for Joe, for his sunflowers, too tall, too yellow, too much like they belonged to the earth instead of the host spreadsheet. Joe raised his hand. It was the first time he'd ever spoke. During meeting. The room froze like someone had walked in with a wolf on a leash. Crinette blinked, lips pulling into the kind of smile you use on strangers who ask for change. Go ahead, Mr. Joseph, she said, like offering bone. Joe stood, slow and steady, removed his hat, and said just one thing. My house, my land, and my barn were here before your HOA ever existed. No flourish, no threat. Just truth delivered in the same tone you'd use to tell someone. Time hush fell so thick it felt like fog. Few faces twisted in confusion. One man near the front squinted at a document like maybe it had a clause about time travel. Crinette's smile remained intact, but her eyes had already narrowed into little slits of war. Legacy zoning doesn't exempt you from community standards, she said. Her voice was clipped, controlled, like someone holding leash just a bit too tight. Joe nodded, placed his hat back on, and sat down. That was all. Features, no debate. But something in the room had shifted, not dramatically, not yet. But enough that even the bagels on the refreshment table seemed to flatten in embarrassment. The rest of the meeting stumbled forward, but the laughter didn't return. Joe's carton of eggs sat untouched next to a stack of disposable plates. No one dared throw them away. They just pretended not to see them. When the meeting adjourned and people filtered out in packs, whispering and peeking over shoulders like children afraid of being assigned blame, Joe walked out alone. Boots leaving quiet prints on the tile. He got home before dusk. The porch light hadn't even flickered on yet. He set the eggs gently by the kitchen window and poured himself a coffee black and slow. From his porch the fields rolled out like an old dog stretching beneath the sunset. Faithful, worn, and still watching, this land had never needed to be defended with words. It had survived droughts, storms, and wars. It had held him when the world felt ungrateful. And now it was being insulted by bylaws written by people who'd never knelt to weed row of tomatoes, sat down in his rocker and didn't rock. Just stared at the barn, at the tarp. At the silence that was beginning to feel like a drumbeat. Toe boards, he thought, only understood two things, control and spectacle. He had both, just not the kind they were used to that night under a ceiling of stars that didn't care about fines or compliance notices. Joe opened drawer in the mudroom. Inside was folder labeled Lanax. It held yellow deeds, old plats with ink fading into the fibers, and letters signed by mayor whose name no remembered anymore. Joe ran his hand over the documents like they were relics from a war nobody knew had ever been fought. And maybe they were. Out in the barn under a heavy canvas tarp, something waited, not with threat, not with menace, just with memory. Joe hadn't touched it in years. Hadn't needed to, but the world had changed, or maybe it had simply revealed itself. They mocked the mud, they mocked the goats, the chickens, the sign hand-painted in weathered wood, they mocked the man, but they hadn't yet met the story. Because Joe wasn't just the quiet man with the eggs. He was the man who'd once led armored units across fractured deserts, the man who'd seen cities fall, who'd given orders from behind steel and smoke. He didn't crave violence, but he understood what it meant to hold it calmly, deliberately. The man who brings eggs to meeting doesn't come empty-handed. He comes with options. And tomorrow he might roll in with history, because there's something about mud. It's not just to boots, but to stories, to legacies, to the bones of the land. They could laugh at him. They could find him. But in that quiet moment on the porch, as the stars kept vigil and the barn stood like a sleeping sentinel, Joe smiled, not with joy, but with resolve. "You want to chill," he whispered. "I'll give you memory." And somewhere in the night, under the tart, forgotten machine waited for morning. The morning air rolled in thick with dew, heavy with the scent of tilled soil and sky not yet decided between storm and sun. Joe stood by the fence post, mug of coffee in one hand, binoculars in the other. It wasn't birds he was watching. It was the pattern of tired tracks, fresh ones, skimming the edge of his eastern field like someone had been curious enough to come close but not brave enough to knock. He sipped slow, let the bitterness spread, and said nothing, not to the goats grazing nearby, not to the chickens pecking by the barn door, not even to the wind that always used to carry news. This time the silence carried something else. Calculation. That week, the letter came, white envelope, red ink, typed words so clean they might have been spit polished. Notice of noncompliance, it read, followed by bulleted list of infractions so absurd it bordered on satire. Unauthorized livestock, $275, unpermitted crop growth, $120, noncompliant signage, $50. Wasn't the money. Joe had seen worse numbers on fuel tanks in the desert. It was the phrasing, noncompliant signage. They meant the wooden sign his father carved by hand the year Joe back from deployment, the one that read, "Welcome to Joe's farm," in weathered cursive, bolted into beam that had survived 2 hurricanes. That sign had more roots than the HOA had rules. Joe folded the letter carefully, placed it next to the eggshells drying on the windowsill, and poured a second cup of coffee, this time stronger. 2 days later, the second event hit harder. No envelope this time. No printed citation. Just a silver lock, new, shiny, hanging from the irrigation spigot like a smirk. Joe had gone out early to check the eastern rows. His tomatoes had started flowering, and he was preparing the back line for corn. But water wasn't flowing. He followed the pipe, puzzled, until he saw it. The lock on the valve, the seam on the pipe, too clean to be weatherware. It wasn't vandalism, it was deliberate. Joe crouched, ran a finger along the plastic collar that someone had sliced, then refastened. Not prank message. He didn't grab the bolt cutters. Not yet. He stood up slowly, wiped his hand on his overalls, and walked back inside. In the corner of his living room was cabinet, plain pine, unassuming, where he stored his trail cam footage. Initially, it had been precaution against coyotes. But now, coyotes weren't the trespassers anymore. He swapped memory cards and settled at the desk in his workshop, the one that still bore scorch marks from welding accident 2 winters ago. The footage played smooth. Static motion, blur, and nothing. Then midnight timestamp, fence line, shadows, 3 figures in polos moving like children playing war, flashlights darting, tools, one of them short, wide-shouldered, bent over the pipe, snipped it clean. Another zap on the lock like it was ribbon on trophy. The third, he posed for a photo, smiling. Joe leaned back in his chair, stared at the screen, and exhaled through his nose. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was documentation. That night, he sent the footage to Carl Evans, an old friend and NIEDA field inspector. Joe didn't write much in the email, just the date, the location, and one line. Trespassing and tampering with ag infrastructure, needed advice. Carl replied within an hour, coming by Thursday. Did not Bozity touch anything. Meantime, Joe waited. He rotated his crops as best he could without water on the east side. Few withered fast. Others clung to life out of habit. His goats grazed indifferent. The chickens didn't notice. But Joe saw the wilting wasn't just botanical. It was personal. It was his livelihood drying at the hands of a group who thought lawn color was more sacred than soil rights. That Thursday, Carl's truck rumbled up the gravel drive. Same old F-150, different decals. He stepped out with clipboard, camera, and the same expression Joe remembered from years ago. The one he wore before every mission. Alert, quiet, already cataloging the exits. They shook hands, didn't speak much. Carl walked the property, pausing at the valve, the trench scar from the pipe, and the sarcastic sign someone had zip-tied to Joe's fence. No dirt allowed. Carl raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. An hour later, he was back at the porch flipping through his notes. "They're idiots," he said plainly. "If this lock touches any food-grade lines, that's phony. If they cut into protected soil," he tapped his pen against his thigh, "they're done. State and federal. In smile, just handed him jar of pickled okra. Carl grinned. You always bribe witnesses with vegetables. Only the honest ones, Joe replied. News traveled faster than it used to. By Saturday, clip surfaced online. Teenager from 2 blocks over had filmed the HOA conducting walkthrough of Joe's property. It showed Karinet pointing, mocking, stepping over boundary lines like Queen inspecting colonies. She didn't know she was being recorded. The best moment, unintentionally comedic, was when one of Joe's goats lunged toward her Prius. She shrieked. Video went viral by noon. Memes followed. Goatgate, the dirt wars. Oakleby B. Kool-Ace tweeted, "We stand with Joe." We pulled pork for farmers. Joe hadn't posted the video, didn't even know about it until someone called for an interview. He declined. He wasn't in it for fame. He was in it for something slower, something rooted. But the HOA did slow down. They doubled down. Another notice arrived, this one printed in bold red ink, declaring that Joe's continued refusal to comply with neighborhood environmental standards had escalated the matter to legal review. Joe didn't react. He filed it under nonsense in drawer now too full to close without resistance. Still, they came again. This time, 3 men in reflective vests, unmarked pickup, no city seals. Joe saw them from the porch before they even stepped onto his land. One held a clipboard, one had survey tape, the third. Well, he looked nervous. They moved like they were told this would be easy, like they expected fight, but weren't trained to win one. Joe walked down, slow, steady, boots hitting the dirt like punctuation. "Can I help you?" he asked. The clipboard man looked up, startled. "Emergency drainage assessment," he said, eyes starting to laminated HOA badge on his vest. Joe stared. "You're not with the county." The man hesitated. "We've been contracted. This land isn't yours to assess," Joe said. "Never was. I have the 1954 zoning plat if you'd like to learn something today." They didn't argue, just planted flags, ran tape, snapped photos, and left without saying goodbye. That afternoon, Joe found the trench 2 feet wide, jagged, careless. It sliced through the edge of his vegetable plot. Lettuce gone, carrots bisected, compost heap torn open like wound. Joe didn't raise his voice. He didn't even curse. He walked into the house, opened a manila folder labeled emergency protocols, and made call to a lawyer he hadn't spoken to in a decade. Then he called Carl. Carl's response was 3 words. "It's on now." The HOA had crossed into zone they didn't even know existed. Joe had filed for veteran land preservation status years ago. Protective clause granting additional safeguards against commercial or administrative interference. At the time it had seemed like overkill. Now it was the sword buried under the plowshare. Joe didn't rush. He installed new trail cams, not for surveillance, for broadcast. His niece in Austin helped him build a web portal. Nothing fancy, just live feed labeled, "Watch them try to steal my dirt." It gained 5,000 subscribers in 2 days. That night, new notice appeared. This one duct taped to his barn door. $600 in penalties, unauthorized water distribution, unauthorized earth disruption. Joe laughed quietly, folded it once, tucked it into his folder marked nonsense. Lit now. Not with gasoline, with stillness, with proof. He didn't threaten, he prepared. Was in wars, even quiet ones. Timing is everything. And the steel under his tarp. It was patient. Just like him, by Sunday morning the air had changed. It wasn't the weather. It was the mood, the charged stillness before thunderstorm, when even the birds go quiet and the earth seems to brace. Joe knew the signs. He had felt it before in deserts far away where silence meant ambush or decision. But this time it wasn't artillery or gunfire. It was paperwork and pettiness dressed in collared shirts and HOA bylaws. And this time, battlefield was his backyard. The trench still gaped across the east field-like scar that refused to heal. Joe had marked its edges with small flags, not to warn others, but to measure the damage. Every inch that had cost him time, every foot that erased his work. The carrots couldn't be saved. The compost would take weeks to rebalance. But the worst part wasn't the loss, it was the principle. Someone had walked onto his land, dug into his crops, and then walked away like they had rearranged furniture. Joe didn't believe in revenge. He believed in consequences. By mid-morning, his niece's live feed had climbed past 10,000 viewers. Comments full, like irrigation water should have. Locals, veterans, strangers from cities Joe had never been to. Some offered legal advice. Others offered prayers. One man from Kentucky simply wrote, "Let me know when to bring my tractor." Joe didn't respond. He wasn't building militia. He was building memory. That same afternoon, the HOA tried again. This time, they staged what they called Community Unity Brunch. Folding tables, sparkling cider, mini quiches, name placards, Carinet ever theatrical, stood in the cul-de-sac like general before the troops, wrapped in pastels and smiling like past 2 weeks had been misunderstanding, but she wasn't apologizing. She was performing, cameras were banned, scripts were whispered, the talking points were clear. Joe was hostile. Joe was unstable. Joe was dangerous because he owned a tank. They didn't call it that out loud, they said. Military equipment, unregulated visual disruption, psychological threat to suburban stability. Joe had read the phrasing in the latest notice. 5-page document left on his gate with the gall summons. What they didn't mention conveniently was that the tank hadn't moved, hadn't made sound. It sat quietly under the same tarp on the same land, registered, legal, and still. They feared it not because it had power, but because it made them powerless. Joe didn't attend the brunch. He didn't need to. His tank was already the most talked-up guest. Instead, he stayed home and tightened the hydraulic seals. He drained the fuel lines, replaced the spark system, and checked the brake tension with the care of someone adjusting an air limb. He wasn't a Bose. He preparing for battle. He was preparing for symbolism. When people ignore your voice, sometimes you let the metal speak. On Monday, the real shift began. A local paper, emboldened by the viral video and the live stream's growing momentum, published a piece titled "The Battlefield in the Backyard." It wasn't satire, it was breakdown. Timeline, footage, expert quotes. One excerpt from Carl stood out. "This isn't man threatening his neighbors. This is man defending right the rest of us forgot we had to grow food without permission." Within hours, national outlets picked it up. Joe's mailbox was flooded, lines with letters, handwritten, typed. One from kindergarten class in Minnesota. Another from a World Oroman who said, "We fought for this land. You remind people why." The next HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening. It wasn't supposed to be public. It was. Residents came in droves, some in support, some still clutching HOA newsletters like prayer books. Joe showed up 10 minutes early in full denim, straw hat in hand, boots still scuffed. He didn't speak at first. He just took seat. Front row center. Right in front of the board. Carinet blinked when she saw him. The other board members stiffened. One cleared his throat and began reading an opening statement about community cohesion and respectful dialogue. Joe waited. When it was time for public comment, he stood. No theatrics, no anger, just posture. Calm upright like a flagpole in wind. "I was told my scarecrow violates community dress code," he said. Ripple of nervous laughter. "Well, I was told sunflowers lean too far, that my goats have attitude, that my compost offends noses." Few heads turned. Neighbor coughed into her elbow. Joe continued. "I served in places where water was life, where food wasn't decoration, where men fought for less than what I have here. I came home to grow something that mattered." He paused, and you all tried to pave it. He didn't shout. He didn't plead. He folded his hat slowly, placed it on the table, and added, "This isn't about tank or goat. This is about remembering that rules don't exist to protect power. They exist to protect people." Silence swallowed the room. Someone clapped, then another. Not everyone, but enough. Carinet tried to regain control. She spoke of compliance, visual harmony, of the need for suburban standards. But her words landed limp. The damage was already done. One board member stood and quietly excused himself. Another checked his phone and didn't return to the table. Joe didn't wait for the vote. He walked out as slowly as he came in. By Friday, things had spiraled. One of the HOA's trench workers had come forward, gave an anonymous statement to local stations saying he was told Joe's land was pre-approved for development and that he had no idea was protected. His voice was distorted, but the anger was clear. Another board member resigned the same day, citing moral discomfort with recent actions. The city council took notice. Special session was scheduled to review HOA authority in zoning adjacent areas. Joe received formal invitation to attend. He declined. Sent statement instead. One line. "I didn't fight wars to argue over sunflowers." That weekend, Joe did something he hadn't done in years. He opened the barn doors all the way, moved out the hay bales, washed the dust off the old machine with garden hose, polished the metal until it gleamed like it still remembered battle. But it wasn't threat. It was theater, metaphor made of steel. When asked by a reporter why he kept it, Joe answered, "Because memory fades. But weight stays." Sunday morning arrived, bright and deceptive. Sprinklers, his children biked past driveways, and in the center of it all, one brunch, another table set again, HOA banners flapping weakly in the breeze. Carinet at the center pouring cider with hands that trembled just slightly, and then the ground rumbled. So deliberate, low, rolling vibration that traveled through plastic chairs and mimosa glasses. Dogs bark. Someone dropped fork. Joe's tank appeared at the end of the cul-de-sac. Not fast, not menacing, but massive, proud, and unflinching. Matte olive paint, wooden placard hung from the front. Respect the dirt or meet the steel. Joe sat in the open hatch, sunglasses, quiet, no smile, no speech, just presence. The hoe froze. Phones rose. Kids stared like they were seeing spaceship. He parked neatly across 4 hallmark parking spots. Not 1 inch more, not one less. Out, adjusted the placard. Picked up fallen name card. Then he spoke, just loud enough. You find me for farming. Lock me for growing. Dug holes in my land. And now you want to act like I'm the threat. He turned slowly. This tank is legal. My land is protected. My lawyer has your names. And that trench, it cut into state-funded soil preservation grant. He paused, looked around. You tried to bury farmer, but forgot we know how to grow from underground. And then he stepped back, leaned against the tank, and waited not for applause, not for permission. He just waited. Let the steel speak. Let silence dig roots where sound used to lie. And for the first time in weeks, the host said nothing, because what could they say? The ground had already answered. By Monday morning, the neighborhood had changed, though the lawn still gleamed with artificial green and sprinklers sang their early hymn. The tank was gone, parked neatly back inside the barn, like it had simply stepped out for breath. But its absence didn't erase its impact. The photos had already made the rounds. Joe standing beside the steel beast like modern-day sentinel of forgotten principles, his quiet fury wrapped in dust. The internet had turned it into 1,000 memes, but none of them captured what the people who were there felt. That was the bows. A tea spectacle, that was reckoning. Joe spent the morning harvesting what was left of the Northfield, boots caked in the kind of mud that felt like defiance now. The wind carried more than pollen. It carried whispers. Neighbors who once looked away now lingered at the edge of their driveways. Man Joe barely knew tipped his baseball cap as he passed. A boy riding his bike slowed just long enough to shout, "Cool tank, mister," before racing down the street. Joe didn't respond, not because he didn't care, but because it wasn't finished. Not yet. Later that day, another letter appeared, this time couriered in person by someone who looked entirely too nervous to be messenger. Joe opened it slowly, callous fingers, unbothered by the red ink that screamed from the header. Psychological threat due to visual harmonics, it read, new one. Apparently, the tank's brief appearance had violated the community's emotional landscape. Joe read the letter twice, not because it confused him, but because he wanted to understand the level of detachment required to write something so ridiculous and believe it. He folded the paper with care, placed it in the nonsense folder, and went back to work. By evening, local news crew arrived. They had asked for an interview before and been turned down, but this time, him with camera already rolling and producer who grew up in town not unlike Joe's. She said softly, just few minutes. You don't even have to say much. Joe stood on his porch, the sun low behind him, casting long shadows across the field. He didn't speak in sound bites. He spoke in truths. I didn't roll in to scare anyone, he said. I rolled in so they'd listen. When you've been ignored long enough, even silence has sound. That night the clip aired on the evening news. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't dramatic, but it struck something deep. The phones at City Hall began ringing the next morning, not with complaints about Joe, but about the HOA. Within 48 hours, 3 more former HOA board members came forward with affidavits. They didn't do it out of guilt. They did it because the tide had turned, and they didn't want to be the last ones left clinging to sinking structure. One of them confessed to doctoring the footage that had been used in internal HOA meetings to portray Joe as volatile. Another admitted that Caroline had pressured him to approve policy changes she herself had drafted violating internal procedure. The city launched an internal review. The state agricultural office escalated its own investigation. The mayor opposed. This office, previously silent, issued a brief statement acknowledging Joe Apos' veteran land protections and thanking him for reminding the community that pride and patience are not mutually exclusive. Joe said nothing. He didn't need to. The documents, the footage, the facts, those were louder than anything he could say. Still, the HOA made one last move. They sent private security firm. Not the official kind, but the Renobadge kind, to survey the perimeter of Joe's property. They wore sunglasses that didn't match their uniforms and stood with the stiffness of people trying too hard to look important. One of them paced near the fence, snapping photos of the goats. Another took long video of the sign that read, "No fines, just food." Joe watched them from the porch, unmoving. He didn't call the sheriff. He didn't shout. He simply stepped inside, pulled out folder labeled the live stream archive, and uploaded the new footage to the portal. Within the hour, it was trending again. Viewers captioned it, "Security harasses chickens, claims they're insurgents." Joe didn't laugh. But the goat seemed amused. 2 nights later, Ramirez returned, not in uniform, not with an entourage, just man with briefcase and file thick enough to crush lies. Joe met him halfway down the gravel path, and they shook hands with the quiet understanding of men who both knew what storms looked like from the inside. Ramirez handed over packet. Over 70 pages, double-sided, violations, timelines, signed statements. Joe didn't flip through it. He just held it like ledger that had finally balanced. Ramirez sat with him on the porch again, same chair, same breeze. You're not the only case, he said, but you're the one they're watching. You made it public. They can't ignore it now. Joe nodded. That was the point, he said. By Thursday, the city council held its emergency session. Joe didn't attend, but the room was full of neighbors who now knew what had happened, not just through headlines, but from watching it unfold live day after day. Petition to recall had gathered over 500 signatures, more than half the neighborhood. By the end of the session, the council voted unanimously to dissolve the current HOA leadership and replace them with the Transitional Oversight Committee. Carinette's name was officially removed from all HOA correspondence. Her house, once fortress of clipped hedges and HOA newsletters, was now quiet, blinds drawn, no brunch. That weekend, Joe set up stand at the edge of his property. Simple wood frame, painted signs. One read, "Vegetables are free. Respect earned." Kids came by first, curious about the tank that now rested peacefully under the barn's shadow. Parents followed, some bringing pies, others just bringing silence. One woman who had once voted for Joe's sunflower find now stood awkwardly by the tomatoes, holding basket. Joe handed her cucumber and said nothing. That was enough. A few days later, a school teacher asked if she could bring her class by for field trip. Joe agreed. He cleaned the tank, set out chairs, and prepared short talk. He didn't tell war stories. He told soil stories, water tables, seed rotations. The tank sat behind him, backdrop of history, while he spoke about the future. One student raised her hand and asked, "Why did you have to use tank?" Joe smiled faintly and replied, "Because sometimes people won't hear the truth until it echoes off steel." By the end of the month, the barn had new sign. Community farm. The live stream remained online, though it now showed garden beds and chicken coops instead of trench drama. Donations began arriving unsolicited. Muralists from the next county offered to paint the side of the tank. Joe agreed on one condition. It doesn't glorify war. The mural was unveiled 2 weeks later. Sprawling countryside with vines climbing over words in soft script. Stand your ground with grace. When the season finally turned and the nights dipped cool again, Joe found himself sitting on the porch like he always had, lemonade in hand, fence repaired, land quiet. The storm had passed, not with violence, but with visibility. And now in the stillness that followed, the tank sat beneath string lights, wrapped in ivy and respect. No more threats, no more warnings. Just the soft rustle of corn in the breeze and the occasional sound of the child laughing while climbing the hatchet history. Joe didn't win. He never wanted to. He endured. And through that, he taught the neighborhood what endurance looked like, when backed not by anger, but by unshakable stillness. By the time summer ripened into its final stretch, the town had long stopped pretending it didn't know Joe. His story had traveled beyond state lines, beyond neighborhoods. But here on his land, things had settled into a new kind of stillness. Not the uneasy quiet of suspicion, but the rooted peace that follows storm that couldn't quite win. The tank hadn't moved in weeks. It rested beside the barn, half draped in shade, vines beginning to creep along the treads, like nature had accepted it as one of its own. Joe didn't touch it except to wipe off the morning dew or check the pressure in the tires every few days, not because he expected to use it again, but because some things deserved care even in rest. The sign still hung from the front. Respect the dirt or meet the steel. No one had dared touch it. No one had asked him to take it down. Each morning, Joe opened the produce stand near the road. He stocked it with cucumbers, squash, sweet corn, and eggs. Small clipboard sat beside mason jar labeled, "Leave what you can." Most left cash, some left thank you notes. One child had drawn crayon picture of Joe with goat on one side and the tank on the other, all three smiling beneath giant sun. Joe pinned it to the inside of the barn. He never said it aloud, but that drawing meant more to him than any headline. One afternoon, as he was repairing the section of fencing that had warped under the July heat, an elderly couple approached him on foot. Joe recognized them from 2 houses down, the ones who had always avoided eye contact and once hosted meeting about maintaining community aesthetics. In their garage, the man carried folded piece of paper. Woman held pie. They looked nervous. Joe stood up, wiped his hands on his pants, and waited. The man offered the paper without a word. Joe unfolded it. It was a hand-drawn map of their property line with a corner section marked in green. Beside it was a note in careful handwriting. We don't use this patch. Thought maybe it could be part of the community garden if you want it. As Joe looked up, the woman smiled gently and said, "Figured it's time we acted like neighbors, not landlords." Joe nodded, took the paper, took the pie, and in that small exchange, years of separation softened just a bit. The community garden expanded. What began as a modest row of lettuce and peppers grew into a mosaic of shared labor. Teens from the local high school came to help after class, earning service hours and homemade pickles. A group of mothers started a weekend workshop on composting and seed saving. The HOA, now restructured and operating under an entirely new charter with transparent measures and rotating volunteer leadership, kept their distance. One of the new board members stopped by the garden and asked Joe if he'd consider joining. Joe shook his head. "I don't do committees," he said, "but I'll show anyone how to test their soil." The tank inevitably became local landmark. People brought visiting relatives to see it, taking photos in front of it like it was national monument. The mural painted on its side had faded slightly from the sun, but the message remained intact. Children would wave at it as they passed on bicycles. Tourists from nearby towns would pull over to take pictures, often leaving with a zucchini or a carton of eggs. Joe didn't mind. As long as they were respectful, they were welcome. Not everyone adjusted so easily. From time to time, Joe would receive strange emails, accusations of being anti-authority, threats hidden beneath anonymous usernames. He ignored them. The investigation into the previous HOA board had concluded months ago. Caroline had quietly moved away. Her house sold to the couple who converted the meticulously trimmed lawn into pollinator garden. Joe never saw her again, but he heard rumors that she tried to start another HOA in new subdivision, that she'd failed, that she blamed the media, that she blamed him. Joe didn't care. He wasn't interested in winning, only in outlasting. One evening in early September, Ramirez returned. No badge this time. Just man in jeans and collared shirt holding thin envelope and bottle of apple cider from nearby orchard. Joe poured 2 glasses and they sat on the porch as the sky turned gold. Ramirez handed over the final report from the state. Signed resolution that officially recognized Joe's property as protected veteran homestead with enforceable zoning boundaries, agricultural autonomy, and legal precedent for future disputes. You set the groundwork for others, Ramirez said. We've already had 3 other farmers file similar claims. But Joe nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. Good, he said. Maybe next time they won't have to roll with steel. Before Ramirez left, he turned back and asked, "What'll you do now?" And Joe didn't answer right away. He looked out across his field where sunflowers now grew tall and bold, unapologetic. "Same as before," he said. "Grow things, fix fences, stay quiet until someone tries to take what isn't theirs." The following weekend, the town hosted its first harvest day in over a decade. Joe hadn't attended public events in years, but this one was different. Organized by volunteers, funded by bake sales and anonymous donations, it was held on neutral ground. The local park, far from the politics of cul-de-sacs and bylaws. Joe arrived in his truck, bringing a crate of fresh tomatoes and a slow cooker full of vegetable stew. Kids from the garden team manned the booth with him, taking turns explaining how compost worked and handing out seed packets. In the afternoon, the mayor gave a short speech. He didn't mention the hoe, he didn't mention the tank, but he said this: "We forgot something for a while, that neighborhoods are supposed to grow people, not just property values. Let this season of remembering." People applauded. Joe stood in the back, hands in his pockets, not needing recognition. Only relevance. That night, back on his porch, the stars were clearer than they had been in weeks. The goats dozed quietly near the barn. The chickens settled in for the evening, cooed with soft rhythm. The tank sat beneath the string lights, not gently flickering like fireflies trapped in amber. Joe sipped lemonade and watched the wind ripple through the tall grass. He thought about everything that had happened, about the trench, the trespassing, the fines, the laughter, the sounds. At the moment, he stood at the center of a brunch, not with a weapon, but with a witness, about the power of waiting until the noise tired itself out, about how sometimes the best way to speak is to stand and let the ground do the talking. He didn't see himself as hero. Heroes go looking for trouble. Joe had just refused to back down. He'd let him come, let him dig, let him escalate, and when it finally mattered, he didn't shout, he showed up. The night approached. Soft knock came at the door. Joe opened it to find the boy from down the street, the one who used to speed past on his bike without word. He stood there holding small potted plant. "It's pepper," he said shyly, "from the seeds you gave me." Joe took the pot, nodded once, and said, "Keep growing." The boy smiled, then ran off into the night. Joe placed the pot beside the others on his porch, then sat down again. The sky stretched above him, vast and unbothered. In the distance sounded low and steady, life continuing, not rushing, just moving forward. And as the last breeze of summer passed through the fields, whispering over steel and soil, like Joe knew that he had not just defended his land, he had reclaimed the meaning of it, that even in a world obsessed with order and polish, sometimes it takes mud and metal to remind people what roots really are. And from that day forward, not a single person ever tried to find a sunflower again.